My name is Toby Tobias Kidd, an artist, musician and writer with a particular interest in the public sphere. This is the third episode of my series, Public Art and the Economics of Imagination, where I investigate the radical potential of public art by questioning the economic structures that operate behind the scenes. It's made with the support of King's College London, Future Narratives Lab and Art School Plus, as well as Professor Schanbaum of Coventry University. Each episode, I speak to an artist, curator, philosopher or expert who share their experiences and perspectives to help us to develop a deeper understanding of both the unique opportunities of art in the public realm and its particular issues and complications. Hopefully, this will enable us to imagine what a better economics of public art might look like. This week, we have the philosopher Colette Olive. She specialises in aesthetics and the history of philosophy. Her research centres on a variety of topics, including whether we can learn from art and whether art improves us morally. She also wrote a paper on how we might define public art, which is something I would like to focus on a little today, to give us an understanding, philosophically speaking, about what we are actually discussing in this series. I also want to ask her about the Russian literary critic V.G. Belinsky in regards to art's more radical possibilities. So I've given a brief introduction. Maybe you would like to give our listeners a bit more about you and your philosophical interests.
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher at Cambridge. I teach mostly aesthetics and 19th and 20th century European philosophy. My research has always been mostly in aesthetics on questions around the value of art, function of art, the different ways in which art intervenes in our non-artistic lives, so our moral lives, our social lives, our political lives, that sort of thing. In particular, I've got research specialisms in Russian philosophy, particularly 19th century Russian philosophy, and my doctoral work was on a 19th century Russian figure called Belinsky, who sketched a sort of vision of art as a vital tool for social criticism, and having this sort of shared role with philosophy in terms of allowing us to come to better understandings of ourselves and the world in both moral senses and political senses. So yeah, that's what I've been working on lately. And I'm working on something at the moment as well that looks at the ways in which art can kind of function as a form of journalism, particularly in oppressive political contexts.
I wonder if you could tell us something about like your interest in public art in particular, and like maybe if there was an experience or something that inspired.
My interest in it flowed quite naturally, I think, from my interest in aesthetics in general, because I was very interested in the political and ethical significance of artworks. And I think public art is a particular kind of art where the political is sort of embedded into the aesthetic in quite an interesting way. And at the time that I'd started, there was actually a lot of discourse around monuments, because I was working on it around the time of the, in the wake of the Black Lives Matters protest in America and the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. And so I think there were kind of lots of discussions around sculptures. And I think that had happened not long after the Maggie Hambling Wollstonecraft sculpture as well, where there was this big discourse around the feminist message of the sculpture and whether it played into negative femininities versus progressive or radical femininities and that sort of thing. So I think it's sort of the two happened quite organically. There was all this discourse going on about public sculptures in the news around the same time that I was kind of coming to this, finding this interest in the political dimensions of artworks and the roles that artworks play in broader political narratives.
One thing that would be nice to talk about more with you, and I think you would give us a really good overview of, is something about the definition in a sort of philosophical way of what public art is and how we might think about it. In some of what I read of yours, you talk about Nicholas Wriggle's structures and definitions and how that might help us. Maybe you could talk a bit about that, or maybe, it might move somewhere else. But yeah, maybe sort of a bit about the definitions and
yeah.
things.
Yeah, so there's a really long-standing debate in the philosophy of art around how we define art, because it becomes very, very tricky to agree on any kind of shared features of artworks that occur in every instance of a thing that we want to call art. So it becomes very difficult very quickly to draw any kind of boundary around the concept of art. Um, and recently in this debate, there has been this move towards, well, perhaps we just sort of, to use Don McIver Lopez's phrase, pass the buck. So rather than trying to define art as a whole, we just focus on defining specific art forms. So he talks about, the possibilities of defining dance or sculpture or painting or even kind of more specific art forms, century Russian constructivism or something like that. And so I think, whereas the definition of art is very difficult to give, there's space to still talk about definitions in aesthetics. And public art seems like a good case where you might think, actually, there is something that we can define here. We've got a quite limited class of objects that we're familiar with. And there's got to be something that instances of public art have in common with each other, right? And what's interesting is actually there's not a huge amount of philosophical literature on this. There's been a lot more debate around defining street art, for example. So Riggle's paper is originally a definition of street art, and I have appropriated it in my paper because I think the structure of it works very well, and I think it can be mapped onto cases of public art. Sondra Bacharach as well has also written a lot on street art. So I think there is space to talk about defining public art. And there are, in some of the existent of art critical and art theoretical writings on public art, there's discussion of what it is for a work of art to be public piece. But there's very little consensus, which is what I think is kind of interesting. And in my paper, I taxonomize what I take to be two different approaches, which is sort of location-based approaches and non-location-based approaches. So I think there's these two camps, really, where on the one hand, people are very keen to keep the idea of location as being something central to public art. So it is the fact that these artworks exist in public spaces that, that's what makes them public art, basically. And then non-location approaches are quite critical of this idea that it's just about where the artwork exists, right? They think there's something much more interesting going on. So Patricia Phillips, for example, says that it's not about the accessibility of the artwork. It's really about the kinds of questions it asks, she says. And the reason that I sort of turned to particularly Riggle's work on this is I actually think, as it stands, a lot of the existent definitions kind of lose something, each one taking an either-or approach and ignoring the role that public space plays in a definition of public art, or, kind of making it all about art's existence in public space. Either one of these approaches, I think, is wrong-headed. And what I liked about Riggle's proposal is he thinks that actually it's not just about something existing in the right kind of space. It's also about how that space is used, and importantly, what that space does internally to the meaning of the work. So Riggle, when he's defining street art, calls he has these two conditions that he takes to be, jointly necessary and sufficient for a definition of art. So every definition, a definition of street art, I should say. So every instance of street art will meet these two criteria, basically, is his claim. And the material condition is that the artist has used the street as what he calls an artistic or an aesthetic resource intentionally in the making of the work. So the artist is responding to the street in their work. It's not just that the piece of street art exists in the street, it's that it's using it, and it's contributing to the work itself in an aesthetic way. But then the immaterial condition is that less about sort of the artistic creation of the work and more about how we interpret the work, because the material condition is that any reasonable interpretation of a piece of street art must make reference to the way in which the artist has used the street in the work. So there, the idea is something like, if we took a Banksy out of its original location, right? If we took it out of the streets and put it into a gallery, Riggle thinks it's quite intuitive to think that something is lost by doing that, right? Something about the meaning of the artwork has been lost. And that, he says, is because in order to properly interpret the artwork, we need to be able to interpret it in its kind of intended surroundings in the street. And so he thinks that correlates to this immaterial condition, this idea that a proper interpretation of a piece of street art will have a necessary feature of it will be a discussion of how the street is used, as a resource in the artwork, and how that location in the street becomes crucial to the meaning of the artwork. And so briefly, my idea was that we could say something similar about public art, that it wasn't just that public art existed in public spaces. It was that, public space was used intentionally to add something to the meaning of the artwork, such that when you take public art out of public spaces, the meaning is changed in some way. And that means that, the interpretation of the artwork requires us to consider it with respect to its public location. And so I think the useful thing about this kind of definition is it helps us make sense of, what it really is for something to be a work of public art. I mean, if you're standing in Trafalgar Square and you're outside the National Gallery, and a National Gallery worker walks past with a Rembrandt and he leans it against the wall, that's a work of art that is currently existing in a public space, and perhaps is even being viewed and appreciated by people in a public space for however long. But I think any of us would be sort of hesitant to call it public art in that example, right? What would make us be a little bit more inclined to call it public art is if someone had done that intentionally, right? They'd gone into the National Gallery and they'd, brought it outside to make a big statement about accessibility in the arts or something like that. At that stage, then we'd probably be more inclined to say, oh yeah, this feels like some kind of performance piece, right? Or some sort of work of activist art.
And it's interesting. Sorry, I was just thinking that because at that point, the work of art actually changes. Because that is not the painting then that's becoming the work of art. The work of art is the action of bringing the painting out.
No, yeah. What I really wanted to understand is what's the difference between someone like Katharina Fritzsch's Hancock in Trafalgar Square, the big blue chicken that was there a few years ago, I think 2016, 17, something like that. This massive blue cockerel that was one of the fourth podium pieces for a while. They kind of go in and out in London. What's the difference between that and the Rembrandt case, right? And I think intention is important. Location is clearly important, but I think perhaps what's most crucial is the way in which the space is used by the artwork. And how that factors into our understanding of the meaning of the artwork. And I found that this approach, the approach that sort of is modeled on Riggle's approach, kind of concedes to both sides of the location and non-location debate, because you get to say something about the importance of location to public art, but that's not the whole story, because if that were the whole story, then the Rembrandt case in Trafalgar Square would probably be public art. So you then get something a little bit more robust or interesting to say about the ways in which space can impact the meaning of public artworks. So I think I think there's lots of work that could be done. I definitely don't think that this definition is infallible, and I'm still kind of revising it and thinking about it a lot, because I think defining these things is always really tricky, especially with a medium that is so changing. But I certainly think as the debate stands, we could really do with a clearer sense of what we mean by public art, because it's clear that, from the accounts of different artists, different theorists, critics, and a few philosophers as well, that everyone has quite a different sense of what they think public art is and what they think it's doing. So I think some kind of more consensus and clarity on that would benefit the practice.
It's a complicated thing where it seems simple, it's art in the public, but actually there's a lot more to it, and the more you delve into it, the more you see that. So I think I'd like to sort of move away a little bit from that now, and it's sort of connected very much to this, but more about like the way that it actually operates when it is there, when you have a piece of public art out in the world. And you've written before about the sort of moral and learning aspects of how art interacts with us. But then what does that mean? How does it operate maybe? What's useful about that or interesting for you?
Yeah, so I think public art is a particularly interesting case because I think it feels as though there are different kinds of moral and political considerations that come in with public art compared to, I'm reluctant to call the opposite of it private art because that feels silly, but, non-public art, shall we say. And I think one of the reasons that is because, the Hancock example is a good example, right? Because it's the sculpture existed on one of the plinths in Trafalgar Square, quite literally a platform. And I think that's a really good metaphor for what public art is. It's a platform. It occupies space. It's given attention. It's given focus. It's given money, which is its own kind of financial platform. And then it exists on that platform. And in certain ways, it imposes itself on others. One of the really interesting political dimensions to public art is understanding what we mean by public, right? And this is something that I found the hardest, really, with the debate. There's a really great paper by Mary Beth Willard on defining public art, and she is keen to move away from this idea of public space being integral to a definition of public art towards an idea of accessibility. So it's not about the existence of art in a public space, where public is in scare quotes, but the fact that public artworks are incredibly accessible. They're really in the midst of our lives. And what's interesting about them being in the midst of our lives is that they are, in some senses, an imposition. So the infamous case of this is Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, right? So if anyone doesn't know, Tilted Arc was this state-sponsored sculpture by the very famous, successful 20th century artist Richard Serra. And it existed in Federal Plaza in Washington. And it's an amazing thing to look at. You should definitely Google it if you've not seen it. It exists in this big square, and it is literally a tilted arc. It's made of steel, and it's enormous. It's huge. And Serra was commissioned to build this piece as a kind of piece of public art for the people who worked in and around Federal Plaza, and people hated it. They really hated it, and they hated it for some aesthetic reasons. Some people just thought it was really ugly. It was just this wall of metal that cut across the square. I think for some people it made the space feel more claustrophobic. It was quite tall as well. I think possibly 11 feet, although I feel like I might be making that number up in my head. Really tall and quite imposing, but there was a very banal reason that people hated it as well, which is because it cut across the plaza. It meant you could no longer take the quickest route across the plaza. You always had to walk around it if you were going from one side of from one corner to the other, and this drove people insane. And so they basically, it ended up going to kind of a hearing, basically court, as to whether this sculpture should get taken down because people protested, people were so unhappy about it, and it got destroyed, it got taken down. And it's a really interesting case, in part because Arthur Danto, the sort of famous critic and philosopher, wrote about it, and I think he even testified at the hearing, and he's got a great article on it, where he basically talks about this political aspect of public art expressly, and acknowledges that there are these sorts of these kind of social and political considerations to public art because of the kind of space it occupies. And he said in the article that the placement of art in the midst of life is not always an unqualified good, and it is still insufficiently appreciated that the right of people to participate in the decisions that affect their lives extends to art when it impinges on their lives as lived. What remains to be explored is what recourse we have over art that is imposed on us without our consent.
Some of what we've talked about is like state-sponsored or very sort of large-scale public art, and public art making. But like with your writing with Belinsky, I think you've talked a lot about the sort of ethical, political aspects of art as well, and in the importance in art making in the public realm. And I wonder like what your thoughts might be on this sort of more radical avant-garde aspect of how art can operate in the public sphere.
It's a great question. And I think it's becoming a more pertinent one because I think increasingly artists are seeing their roles as becoming more politically charged, more overtly politically charged. And lots of artists I've noticed come to see their work as really embedded in their moral and political lives, and not kind of existing in isolation from it. Belinsky was someone who really anticipated this idea. So he was writing in 1830s and 40s Russia, where philosophy had been outlawed. So for those who don't know their Russian history quite so well, in the early 19th century, there was the Decembrist uprising, which was this kind of revolt against the Tsar. And this was responded to by Nicholas I with punitive measures that basically rolled out huge, massive censorship laws. So you could say very little, basically, in the public sphere. You couldn't be critical of the Tsar. You couldn't be critical of the state, the church, anything like that. And importantly, Nicholas thought that the philosophers had played an important role in this revolt, and so he banned philosophy. You couldn't teach it in universities. You couldn't publish it. You couldn't write anything about it. So all the kind of philosophers went underground, basically, and Belinsky was one of them. And he saw art in the wake of this kind of banning of philosophy as the best hope, right? The best hope they had of getting ideas out there, and of getting kind of socially critical ideas out there. And so for him, art was going to be the real last bastion of resistance against what he saw as oppression, omnipresent oppression in late 30s and 40s Russia. And so what this does then is it kind of casts art as a moral and political tool. So it's something that we engage with and use to improve our understanding of ourselves, others, to gain some insight into how we ought to treat others, what the ideal state should look like. And a really concrete example of this that's borne out by a lot of the art that was produced at the time is a concern with the lives of serfs. So Russia still had a feudal system at the time, and they want the emancipation of the serfs was this big political movement that all the philosophers and artists were deeply concerned with, this shift towards democracy. So he was keen for artists to use this idea of platform, use their platform as a way to push for this message and kind of contribute to this political movement towards the abolition of serfdom in Russia. So I think you see that kind of idea that artists use their art in order to kind of improve people's moral and political awareness, the way they think about themselves, the way they think about others, the way they understand the structure of the state, the way they think about how we ought to kind of treat people. In some sense, what's interesting about Belinsky is he sees all art as in some sense public art. So for him, because art has this inherent political power, and because it is a certain kind of platform, he understands art as having these sorts of obligations.
Thinking about what you were just saying about that kind of position that art have, I wondered what might happen if you might map some of that onto what we might want to try and achieve, the possibilities that you give public art.
Yeah. I mean, so I think the kind of possibilities of public art, as you say, are really quite impressive. And I think when it's done well, it can achieve a lot. And, the example Ai Weiwei, I think, is a good one. I think Ai's work, a lot of Ai's public work has made enormous differences to how people think about issues around migration, free speech, censorship, China more broadly. And so I think it is possible for artworks to make these really positive contributions. I think what gets in the way is I'm not always sure that what happens when some of these artworks gets put up is a productive, respectful debate going on between artist and audience. So I think very often what goes wrong with public artworks is they're either ignoring the space they're in, ignoring the community that the artwork kind of serves, or talking past them, talking down to them, not listening to them. And equally, sometimes when we respond to public artworks as audiences, members of the public, we often don't spend enough time thinking about what's going on in the piece. We don't really respond to it as viewers, we don't have a kind of aesthetic response to it. We sort of absorb it and walk past or whatever. And I think London is a really interesting place for this sort of thing, because we've got tons of pieces in London that are kind of really important works of art. I mean, there are endless Banksies, and that sort of thing. There's loads of amazing street art in London. But there's also loads of what Hilda Hine in her book on public art calls corporate baubles. And these are just, public artworks that decorate some fancy housing estate in Mayfair, or, go in the middle of Grosvenor Square, or some corner of the city. There's tons of this stuff that is, I think, cynically you might say is not really thinking about what it's doing. It's just kind of decorating what is otherwise an ugly space. And perhaps more charitably, you might say, does make some kind of effort to engage with its surroundings, or, have some kind of message that in some way relates to its surroundings, but perhaps doesn't execute it very well. I'm always interested in what goes on with when you have to, because I think there's lots of times when you build these sorts of developments where you have to basically put some kind of public art work down, and you have to commit to something. And I'm always really interested in, how these people get commissioned to build these, quite hideous sculptures sometimes. And, that I sort of cynically worry that you spin this kind of yarn that explains why this, zebra with 3 legs and a pink party hat on or something is really meaningfully engaging in the community by offering some site for repose and contemplation, like all this sort of nonsense. I really worry that goes on a lot, and particularly with these corporate baubles. So I think in terms of thinking about the future of public art and what we might want from it, I think what we'd really want is for artists to really, really think hard about the relationships between the works that they want to create and the spaces that those works are going to live in, and how those two might kind of organically and productively feed into each other. And it sounds like a lot of the work that you've been doing and that you some of the artists that you've been interviewing for this series are really good examples of that, where it's about thinking about the history. You mentioned the history of Bloomsbury, for example. Engaging with the past of these places as well, I think, is really important, and often something that doesn't seem to be there. But then again, I think there's also, it's not just a question of me complaining about artists making ugly sculptures in Mayfair. I think there is also some responsibility on the part of us, viewers of public art, to kind of do some aesthetic work, to really kind of think about what it's doing, what it's contributing. And again, a nice example of this, I think, is Gormley's Angel of the North, which, I think is one of the most important and emblematic pieces of British public art. And I hadn't really realized, I kind of understood, I recognized it as a symbol. I knew what it was a symbol for, and I had that sort of understanding of it. And I didn't realize until a few years ago that it's built on the site of an old mining bathhouse. So it's on a kind of natural mound, and that underneath that was it used to be this old bathhouse for the miners in the area. And so it's actually really, in terms of the location of the sculpture, of the piece, it's really tied to the heritage of the area, to the history, to narratives and ideas that are important to the identity of the area. And so it's doing a lot more than I kind of had given it credit for, because I'd just not really ever looked into it. And so I think it cuts both ways. I think we want art that really does do that sort of thing, really does engage with the narratives of its place, and uses its resources, positively, as with eyes work or environmentalist work and things like that, and perhaps less or fewer kind of thoughtless corporate baubles. But equally, we want to, I think it would be good if, particularly as a Londoner who's always walking around at 60 kilometers an hour, just sprinting from place to place, like not really engaging with my environment in any way meaningfully most of the time. I think sometimes it's really positive to kind of slow down and look and really see, and spend time thinking about the aspects of my environment, rather than charging around like a headless chicken.
I think, what's interesting to me, with what you're saying there is, how the economic structures allow artists to do that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think the fact that I've already, there's kind of a clue in corporate baubles, right? Which is the corporate bit of it, so much of this is, so much of the radical possibilities of a platform like public art is just utterly undermined by all these kinds of, by so many different capitalistic contexts that they operate within. I mean, artists themselves are under various kinds of financial pressures, and communities have obligations to their citizens and to their members, that are often tied in various ways to money. And these big development companies that build all these sites in London and want their pretty zebras with their party hats, they're driven by economic concerns. So I mean, there's no real way of teasing art out of these contexts, right? And Adrian Piper, I think, is one of the best artists and thinkers on this idea. There really is kind of no room of one's own for the artist. You can't, that idea that if you just give people enough like space and resources and time, they'll be able to produce the right kind of radical artwork is just, in this era, I think, nonsense. Everyone is operating within these contexts that they can't take themselves out of, these financial backgrounds, political ideologies, all that kind of thing. So I think it really does become hard to create something genuinely radical, particularly in a public setting, because public spaces are rarely radical spaces. Public spaces are fundamentally quotidien, everyday, dull, used by everyone. And they're not neutral spaces, they're politically charged, and it's possible to make them politically charged. But they, they're not kind of blank canvases for artists to paint on, I think. And I think what really good public art does is recognize that and acknowledge that there's stuff going on already. There are issues here, there are tensions here, in different political identities, different political communities, different, kind of financial and economic contexts. So I think I don't have much anything particularly hopeful to say about that. I think it's exactly something I worry about is just how difficult it is to resist these kinds of economic structures and to genuinely create something radical. But it does happen, and so it's clearly possible because there are great examples of it out there. But even the idea of someone like Banksy, who started out as, I think, quite a radical artist with quite radical messaging, now sells works in Sotheby's, and obviously there's the kind of the performance piece. I can't remember what it was called, where he shredded the painting. I think that was either Sotheby's or Christie's. But even so, like, I think the radicality of that kind of message is really lost because I found, particularly with that kind of piece, there was something deeply self-indulgent about it. And it's a hell of a thing to try and say fuck you to a very expensive gallery in Mayfair, whilst, pulling in huge amounts of money from those same kinds of economic hours. So I don't know. I have a bit of a kind of worry about this and about the possibility of genuinely radical art, particularly in public contexts. Are you a bit more hopeful? Yeah. Do you have?
Well, I think there's always always room for people to make changes, and I think that it's worth thinking about and moving towards things. I think that small gestures do add up. Yeah.
That's a really nice idea, though, the idea that it's kind of a piecemeal thing, small gestures make a difference. And I think, that's perhaps that's like one way of moving forward, is to focus on these smaller interactions rather than kind of really worrying about, big pieces, what big pieces like Anish Kapoor's been, as going to achieve in Chicago. We should worry about like what murals might do in housing estates in London, and what kind of sculptures outside schools might do for those smaller communities. So yeah, I think maybe that's a more kind of wholesome way of thinking about it.
It would just be really nice to see where people can find your work or follow you, or like or things you're working on right now that we can look forward to.
Yeah. So I'm not big on social media, but I do have a website, which is coletteolive.com, and that I keep updated with publications and talks and things like that. And yeah, I do a fair few public-facing philosophy talks as well. So those I will keep on my website in case anyone's ever interested. They're often kind of on aesthetics and the history of philosophy. So anyone who's interested in that sort of thing can find those dates there.
Thank you to Colette Olive. I think we really gained an insight into some of the philosophical considerations of public art and how public spaces are politically charged and already filled with meaning. I hope you enjoyed our third episode. I will see you next time on Public Art and the Economics of Imagination, where I speak to the artist Bob and Roberta Smith about his political art practices and his experience of making art in the public realm.